Hello and a very warm welcome to the Ideas Factory. I'm Naghma. Joining me is Professor Pant. Some of the key things that we will be looking at on this episode of the Ideas Factory are, of course, the Prime Minister Modi's US visit, the first in person Quad summit that took place, the first bilateral meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Joe Biden, and, of course, the UNGA. So we will be analyzing all of those. A very warm welcome to you, Harsh. And let's begin with the Prime Minister's US visit by asking, how do you actually analyze in terms of what did India achieve? If we look at the bilateral, which was not really the main focus, the main focus, of course, was the UNG and the Quad, but it took place nevertheless. And it was the first time Prime Minister Modi met President Biden after he assumed office. We all know that Prime Minister Modi shared a good rapport with ex-president Donald Trump. He even, pitched for his election campaign. Looking at all of that, did that affect their, the personal chemistry, or how do you actually look at this bilateral meeting, and what were the key takeaways from this bilateral meeting that took place?
Thanks, Naghma. I think if you look at Mr. Biden's foreign policy at the moment, it's not Mr. Biden is under pressure on a number of fronts, and even his closest allies are not happy with him. So I think if you take that big picture view, you would say that this visit and the bilateral engagement, the bilateral outreach to Mr. Biden by Mr. Modi, I think comes at an important time for Mr. Biden himself. Because he has just after AUKUS, the US, the Australia, UK, and US trilateral security pact, uh, the European Union is terribly unhappy with him. France, of course, is unhappy, and there are discussions whether Mr. Biden is basically carrying forward the unilateralism of Mr. Trump. So I think in that context, if you see his engagement with Mr. Modi, it seems to me that it has been relatively fine. It came off, all the important issues as far as from India's point of view were articulated. They are part of the joint statement. Uh, I think from India's point of view, the fact that Afghanistan-Pakistan issue has become very, very salient in the last few weeks, that was articulated. From America's point of view, I think we saw emphasis on how to take forward the trade part of the agreement, of the bilateral engagement, and there was a lot of focus on what can potentially be done in a manner that takes the conversation forward on a very important issue which is stuck. And remember, this is also a government, much like Mr. Trump, that believes that all foreign policy is about middle class. So, in a sense, unless India and India's ability to deliver on certain fronts becomes vivid, I think these kinds of conversations would continue. But I thought that overall, despite the issue of democracy and human rights that was also raised by Kamala Harris and by Mr. Biden, I thought that overall the engagement was productive. Both sides listened to each other, and even on democracy, what we are looking at now is a relationship that is very mature. That is India used to get very prickly about some of these things. Today, India, more confidently acknowledges them, and also tries to shape the conversation in a way that is not an irritant but more a productive way in which two friends talk to each other. So by and large, if you are looking at the even the optics of it, it seems to me, yes, of course, compared to the last visit and what happened with Mr. Trump, that may not be there, but I think that was not the purpose either. If Prime Minister was going for the UN General Assembly meeting and the Quad meeting, to which he was invited by Mr. Biden, I think the very fact that the two leaders have been meeting regularly virtually, and the fact that Quad is happening within 6 months, now the second time, the leaders level summit itself indicates the level of interaction between the two sides, and that for both sides the strategic realities overpower any other irritants that might be there in the relationship. And the
So,
agenda that has been set is very, very important and ambitious, both bilaterally, quadrilaterally, as well as multilaterally.
So, Harsh, if I may just add to this, do you think, like you said, that the relationship is more mature now, but the president's remarks on shared responsibility to uphold democratic values or joint commitment to diversity, would these in any way affect the strategic importance that both countries have for each other? They both understand that, but would that affect the relationship or the trajectory of Indo-US relationship, or do you see any kind of change in the trajectory, or is it more clear now? What's the shape that the Indo-US relationship will take place under President Biden?
I think it's very clear. I don't see any change or any a dramatic shift in the wider trajectory. Uh, I think the fact that India and America are two biggest democracies in the world, two most important democracies in the world, and at a time that they are trying to take a position vis-a-vis China and the various authoritarian and autocracies, authoritarian systems and autocracies around the world. There is a question of the larger narrative. And I think that for that narrative also, it is very important that the whole question of democracy is put front and center. And if you see, Prime Minister's speech at the UN General Assembly started with the whole issue of democracy. Of course, he was, there were multiple constituencies when he was, addressing that question. But I think it was very clear that for both India and the US, the fact that we are multicultural, multi-ethnic democracies, the fact that we value pluralism, those factors are important and they cannot be shunned aside. And both are at a stage in their relationship that they can talk about these things. Now, see, I mean, let us also not overdo values, because we know America has had a very stable and strategic partnership with Pakistan for all these decades.
And continues,
America,
continues.
a very, very close relationship, and still is. If for many Indians, that has always been this big conundrum. Here is India, democracy, and yet we struggle to get along with the US. So I think that's one element, that I think the strategic imperatives of the relationship are changing in a direction where, while values matter, the strategic imperatives are the most important drivers at the moment. The Indo-Pacific, China, the fact that America needs partners like India, the fact that India needs partners like America. But I would also point out another thing, that for Mr. Biden and Kamala Harris, for the vice president, we in India, there is always the sense that it is almost always, we are being talked to. Of course, Mr. Modi was visiting, so he was being addressed. But I think there is a domestic constituency there. They have to address their own domestic constituencies in the Democratic Party that have all, and there is a very vocal constituency now within the Democratic Party that wants these leaders to speak about these matters. So I think they were also addressing that domestic constituency by when they were publicly talking about these issues. So I don't think that everything was about Mr. Modi and India. Part of it was about their domestic politics, much as what Mr. Modi was doing was also about Indian domestic politics.
Absolutely. He started his speech by referring to India as the mother of democracy. Now, if you look at the joint statement, after the bilateral meeting, the Indo-US joint statement, it of course talks, or it condemns cross-border terrorism. It denounces the use of terrorist proxies and emphasizes the importance of denying logistic, financial, and military support to terrorist groups, which could be used to launch or plan terror attacks. Now, how do you see this joint statement? A lot is being made out of this. Do you think it was a big gain for India that this was mentioned, considering a lot of critics are also talking about how US actually has not done much as far as terrorism emanating out of Pakistan is concerned? Like you just mentioned, Pakistan remains to be of strategic importance to America for some reason. Now, probably to establish contact with the new Taliban government, but not much has been done. So, how do you look at this statement?
I think, ever since the withdrawal of American forces from Afghanistan, there has been this big debate about what America should be doing. And from India's perspective, what are some of the issues that should be put on the table? And this Afghanistan Pakistan issue for India now is very, very important. And I think both in the bilateral statement and the quadrilateral statement, we find that India's views have been well represented. Because after all, what India has been saying to its partners, like US, Japan, and Australia, that we are willing to engage in the Pacific, but how far are you willing to engage with us on the Western frontier? And I think the signals, what we are hearing, and both in terms of the statement as well as the vice president making the mention of Pakistan and in her statement as well, that and of course a few weeks back, Secretary of State Blinken's statement in the US Congress, that we have to reassess our Pakistan policy now. How far do they, how far that reassessment goes, and to what extent it delivers for India, that remains to be seen. But I see definitely this aspect that as America moves out of Afghanistan, the sense that India has been able to convey to the Americans and to the American establishment is that this is going to remain a very very important frontier both for India, for the region, and for the West. So I don't think the question arises that America can decide one fine day that they will have nothing to do with what is happening in the FPAC belt. So the pressure and India's role in making sure that its partners continue to put pressure on Pakistan is one aspect which I think has been an important part of this journey of the Prime Minister, because on both the bilateral and quadrilateral front we are seeing that becoming part of India's diplomatic initiatives in more and more, as was also evident in the recent 2+2 dialogue with Australians, where this point was mentioned and Australians supported India. So I think gradually the idea is to mobilize like-minded countries on this issue, and of course with Pakistan the issue remains how far America would be willing to go, and what it is going to how is it that it will deliver on the ground the changing realities that are emanating from Afghanistan via Pakistan. So I think that remains to be seen. But the fact that this is something that India was able to convey, and America was able to accept in a joint statement, is something of a of the new diplomatic relationship that we are carving out, and a part of this ongoing conversation with the US on terrorism and counterterrorism.
Yes, and the United Nations General Assembly took place at a time when the world has been dealing, I mean, after, or maybe a lot of countries are still in the middle of the COVID crisis. So it took place in the middle of all this and the Afghanistan crisis. There were many important things that the world leaders had to talk about. But of course, Afghanistan has been the center point and the concerns that were expressed. But at the same time, Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan coming there and actually saying that the world needs to engage or strengthen the current Taliban government for a win-win situation. Uh, I mean, how do you see this? When we were just talking about it, that Prime Minister Modi has actually made it very clear now at an international platform what really is India's policy towards a new government. But the statement or the speech, the Pakistani Prime Minister, how do you analyze this?
Well, it was an interesting speech because Kashmir and Afghanistan were the two issues that he focused a lot on. The Pakistani Prime Minister, and of course, if you look at the information that is coming out of Afghanistan, that is quite dreary. That is quite disturbing, because now we are hearing increasing political revenge,
Yes. Hmm.
being pursued by the Taliban, the political, targeting of political opponents, and increasingly the old brutality is back with hangings in public square. The kind. So I think there is a problem in terms of the wider narrative of recognizing, and I think. Countries like Pakistan and to a certain extent China know that the longer this continues, the longer they are not able to get recognition from the world, the more challenging it will become. So I think there was a reason why Mr. Imran Khan was pointing that out, and then we're pushing that in the UN General Assembly. But I think it is equally clear that at least for the larger part of the world, they are in no hurry to do this. I think there's still this idea that why should we go ahead and legitimize a government, and legitimize a regime that is still, that has shown no inclination for moving towards political moderation and the political center. So, and I think what India has been able to do is also from UN General Assembly point out two things. One, the that of course Afghanistan should not be used for to attack other countries and should not become a tool for other nations. But the other important point that I think Prime Minister mentioned, which was I think uh, is for United Nations or a platform like United Nations, the most important aspect, that what can be done about ordinary Afghans who are suffering every day, and that's a question that has not been answered. because it's the binary that is emerging or that has emerged is whether or not to negotiate or engage with the Taliban. But for a platform like United Nations, it's a larger humanitarian role that is at stake. If And again, the Indian Prime Minister pointed it out, I think very effectively, that we have seen UN becoming redundant on a number of issues, and there is a danger that even on Afghanistan it will become redundant if something urgently is not done for minorities, for women and children, for the larger future of Afghanistan. So I think that's an important point on which India has been able to shape up some of its partners' narratives, some of their partners' policies, whether bilaterally with the US or countries like Australia, and now with the quadrilateral also coming out very very clearly that Afghanistan's what role they see for Afghanistan and how they see Afghanistan emerging out of the present crisis.
Yes, and of course, the first in-person Quad meeting also took place, where all the four leaders were there. I've been reading a couple of analysis which has been critical of the Quad Summit too, and they say that not much emphasis was actually placed on the non-security global issues. Does that mean that its strategic significance is diminishing? And we have a question from our viewer, which is actually about the AUKUS and the Quad. Uh, so Jaydeep Gadhavi and Vinil Mishra ask a similar question and say that is AUKUS complementary, or Akshay Pandit asks, is AUKUS complementary to Quad, or has USA again backstabbed its Quad allies? The AUKUS was not mentioned really in the meeting. So these are some of the questions that are coming up. How do you analyze this?
See, I see, AUKUS broadly complementing a Quad. I think that from an Indian perspective, any platform, any engagement that puts pressure on China is good for us. In India, we have had a very, very strange debate about AUKUS. For a long time, we have been saying that we value our strategic autonomy. We want to be non-aligned. We want to, we don't want to go closer to the US. And then we complain when America supplies cutting-edge technology to Australia. We are not Australia. Australia is a treaty alliance partner of the US. They have a different engagement. They have a different relationship. So if they are supplying certain technologies to Australia, that's within the parameters of that relationship. If we are not talking about those challenges or those technologies with the US, that's because we are scared of moving in a certain direction. So ultimately, when we often talk about Quad and AUKUS, it's for Indians to decide how far they want to go with the US. If we are still struggling, and we have had some very senior people in the establishment, in the strategic establishment, who have said that we still want to have equidistance from US and China. Now, if that is what you want to do, then be prepared for this. Then you are not going to get certain technologies. Now, I see. Maybe I'm being very simplistic, or I don't understand what people are talking about, or there is a certain nuance in the views of people. But there is a certain, incessant complaining about America that goes on. America does this, we complain. America does that, we complain. Ultimately, I think we have to decide how far we want to go. We have to decide what our strategic priorities are. If we are happy still being non-aligned, I think we should take it all in our chin and expect this to happen more and more. If we believe that we have time has come to make certain choices, then let's also clearly state some choices and work with our partners towards those goals. Australia has made a choice. Australia has, and they also deterred for a long time. They were saying, all right, whether we have such an economic relationship, important one with China, can we afford to antagonize China? Now they have decided they want to antagonize China,
Mhm.
so they are going all out. But India is not. So at the end of the day, this is a debate that India has to resolve. At the end of the day, this is a debate that we have to figure out what are, how, in which direction we want to go. But I would also like to mention that as far as Quad is concerned, look, if we start saying that Quad does not have a strategic dimension, I think we are misunderstanding what strategic dimension actually means. Because if we, the only thing it lacks at the moment is that I think there is a reluctance to call it a security partnership. And I don't think between Australia, US, and Japan, there is a security partnership. We are the only outliers there. We are not bound by treaty alliance with any of these countries. We want that flexibility to be there with us. But the challenge for Quad is that if you start saying that this is a strategic block against China, what you are doing is you are alienating a lot of the other stakeholders in the conversation. For example, if you want to build supply chain resilience in semiconductors or in certain other specific issue areas, you need partners like Taiwan, South Korea, ASEAN, and you want to reach out to them. You want to build a broader coalition. This time, Quad's joint statement talks explicitly about countries' EU's Indo-Pacific agenda because they want to link up with the EU. And this is something that India has highlighted. Why? One of the problems that India has had with AUKUS is that it pushes France out of the spectrum. But India wants France in. India wants a wider coalition. And again, I think that is something that India brought to the table of Quad. And I think that is one of the reasons why we have seen the Quad expanding the remit, Quad talking about Quad plus arrangements, Quad talking about building a wider coalition. But I think strategically, all the important aspects today, whether it is vaccines, whether it is technology, whether it is infrastructure, they are all strategic in orientation at a time when even North Koreans are sending back their Chinese vaccines. This is the time for Quad to step up and play its a vaccine game.
Yes.
If India can supply vaccines with the help of Americans, Australians, and Japanese, that would fill that void and that would make Quad a credible actor in the Indo-Pacific. So I think if we can do that, that would be very good. But I think Quad and AUKUS should be looked at separately. They
Mhm.
complement AUKUS will complement what Quad is trying to do. But I think at the end of the day, it's for India to decide which direction it wants to take and how far it wants to go
Absolutely.
on certain of these issues.
Absolutely, very, very. It's a very logical point that India needs to decide how far does it want to go, and what's the equation that it wants to maintain with US and China. But like you were pointing out, Harsh, that all these things now, whether it's vaccine or 5G, they are all strategic in orientation. Another of our viewer, Anand Sangameshwaran, has also raised this point. I'll just read out what he's written because you've already answered this. That apart from vaccine, 5G, etc., shouldn't the Quad also increase military and strategic cooperation, especially in the South China Sea? So this has been answered. What are the pros and cons of calling it really a military and strategic alliance? But thank you so much for answering that. And we have time for just this much on this episode of the Ideas Factory. We shall meet you next week. Thank you for watching.